Mhm. From the Washington, D.C. studio, welcome to our special coverage of the US midterm election. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hannah Zuberi. For the news, let's go to our colleague, Samia Sayed, for today's top stories.
Thank you, Hannah. Now for our top story tonight, 35 Muslims were elected in the state assemblies and Senate in Tuesday's elections. Muslims in Illinois, Georgia, Maine, New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas made history by electing new members. A record-breaking 145 American Muslim candidates ran for local, state, and federal office in Tuesday's midterm election. That included 48 state legislative candidates in 23 states. John Fetterman narrowly defeated Dr. Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania on Tuesday. His election flips a crucial Republican-held Senate seat as Democrats try to maintain control of the upper chamber. If elected, Oz would have been the first Muslim senator in American history, but metro areas of Pennsylvania, which has more than 114 mosques, did not seem to be impressed with Oz being a Muslim. All three Muslim lawmakers in the U.S. House are projected to cruise to re-election in Tuesday's midterm elections. Various outlets have called the races for Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Andre Carson. Omar and Tlaib are part of a group of 6 progressive House lawmakers known as the Squad. Fox News projects that the Squad is likely to grow in the next Congress by as many as 10 members. Keith Ellison defeated Republican challenger by 20,000 votes to be re-elected as Minnesota Attorney General. Ellison became the first Muslim congressman, chair of the Progressive Caucus, and vice chair of the Democratic Party. He left his safe congressional seat to run for the Attorney General position and won. Schultz, a Republican newcomer to politics, ran his campaign by blaming Ellison for rising crime. In a statement, Ellison said he's grateful for the win, adding, "This election was tough. Millions of dollars were spent to sow division, hate, and fear, and we overcame it. We were positive, and Minnesotans responded." As votes continue to be counted to declare which party will control Congress, projections are predicting a Republican win in the U.S. House. But 538 projects that Democrats are now slight favorites in maintaining a narrow edge in the Senate. ABC News estimates that Republicans have 207 seats to the Democrats' 188, putting the GOP in position to win a majority. The hotly contested Senate contest in Georgia most likely will hold the balance of the Senate control. Georgia runoff is on December 6th. Donald Trump immediately began casting doubts on the midterm vote through his Truth Social platform on Tuesday, pointing to problems with voting machines in Arizona. Same thing is happening with voter fraud as happened in 2020, he said. Federal election monitors will be deployed to various poll locations in 5 Arizona counties starting Tuesday. This is despite numerous investigations, including a Republican-funded one, found no evidence of fraud in the 2020 elections. In the run-up to Tuesday's midterms, Republicans and Democrats have filed dozens of lawsuits in battleground states that hold the key to control the U.S. Congress. The lawsuits challenge various rules governing the elections. The bulk of them are focused on the casting and counting of mail-in ballots that have grown in popularity in recent years. As of Monday, a total of 128 election and voting-related lawsuits have been filed so far in 2022, according to Democracy Docket, a left-leaning voting rights organization that tracks election litigation. For decades in Dearborn, Michigan, despite an overwhelming need for access to Arabic language ballots, there was no political will to do it. That is, until now. In Michigan's August primary election, for the very first time, voters in Dearborn could access official Arabic language ballots to cast their votes. That's all for the news today. Let's go back to our special election coverage. Over to you, Henna.
Thank you so much, Samia. Let's invite our guests on air. We have today with us Shahan Rizvi. He's the chairman of the Howard County Democratic Party in Maryland. And we also have with us Dr. Fadl Kaboub. He's the associate professor of economics at Denison and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. So as we wait for Shahan to come on, I'd like to start this discussion. Let's talk about what impact this election will have on climate change as the results start coming in.
Well, as you know, it's not very clear yet which way the Senate will go. It looks like the Republican Party is winning the House of Representatives majority and will control the House. And as a result, President Biden will have a little bit more difficulty getting any spending bills, any new regulations through a Republican Party that is apparently determined to make the Biden presidency a one-term presidency and to suffocate the legislative process as much as possible over the next 2 years to create a situation where the American public feels that the Biden administration did not deliver on its promises and was not able to manage the inflation problem that we're going through right now. As a result, for the Republican Party, climate change and climate action and climate regulations are certainly not on their priority list. If anything, they'll be the types of pressure points that they will use against the Biden administration to articulate that it's probably this excessive spending on climate infrastructure that caused inflation. And so that's the narrative that is most likely to come out of the Republican-controlled House of Representatives and Republican narrative over the next 2 years. Now, that obviously has nothing to do with what's causing inflation. As we've discussed many times on this program, the United States has a handful of inflation pressure points that existed before even the COVID pandemic, before even the conflict in the Ukraine. And those are related to the housing market, related to healthcare, higher education, and energy and transportation. And we haven't addressed those. And unfortunately, it looks like Congress in the next 2 years is not going to be able to address those inflation pressure points to begin with. And then we had the COVID disruptions related to traffic jams in the oceans, disruptions to global supply chains, especially coming from Asia. All of that adds additional pressure points on inflation. And of course, with the conflict in the Ukraine, we have global energy prices and global food prices rising substantially because of the disruption to the major production that comes out of Ukraine and Russia. And the sanctions and counter sanctions obviously add even more disruption. So the question is, will a Congress that's controlled by Republicans, even if the Senate is in the hands of Democrats, will they be able to address any of these global inflation pressure points to bring down inflation and allow the US government to focus on other priorities other than inflation, that is climate change, both here at home and abroad? Let's not forget that we're in the midst of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which is where world leaders are supposed to come to an agreement, not just on reductions of CO2 emissions to meet the climate challenge by the end of the century, but also hopefully agreement on phasing out fossil fuels on a rapid schedule, because that is the big elephant in the room, that we keep talking about reducing emissions without actually talking about reducing the production of fossil fuel that produces most of the emissions. And the final issue that is hopefully going to be on the table during these negotiations in Egypt this week is climate finance. How do we transfer financial resources, technology, and know-how and resources to developing countries in the global south that are on the front lines of climate change, and increasingly so, and countries that actually have not contributed to climate change? The continent of Africa as a whole emits the same amount of emissions as Spain, a single country in the global north. So historical emissions, as a result, suggest that there has to be reparations, climate reparations from the global north to the global south. And the US has to be part of the leadership in structuring climate finance, structuring these financial reparations, because we're all in this together. So unless we sort out the internal politics and the internal economic priorities first, I'm afraid the US is not going to turn to these global issues and set them as priorities, especially if the Republican Party, with the dominant narrative that they set during the elections and during their campaigns, is going to dominate the US politics in the next 2 years.
Well, thank you for that, Professor. We also have with us Dr. Amina McLeod-Dean, who is the host of Critical Talks and a professor of Islamic Studies, formerly at DePaul University, joining us. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Amina.
Walaikum salam, both of you. But I want to go back to Professor. Can you pronounce your last name again, please?
Fadel Kaboub.
Kaboub has, I mean, you just laid it out. But I want to go back to a couple of things. With the U.S. as a leader, many have suffered. Do we really want the U.S. and it seems as though you're saying that the U.S. is a good agent in this, and the U.S. hasn't proved itself to be a good agent. I mean, if we want them to take over financial restructuring, etc., I mean, African countries, for one, have been in debt to the IMF forever and will be in debt forever. And we don't have any intention of letting them out of the debt. So why would we want to put them in more debt?
I completely agree with you. I was not suggesting additional debt to the African continent. If anything, when I talk about the concept of climate reparations, colonial reparations, and neo-colonial reparations, because the extraction of wealth continues to this day, as you suggest, from this external debt entrapment that the global South finds itself in. When I talk about these reparations start with, number one, telling the truth, as in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that is calling
a different country.
Exactly, and that is our responsibility as U.S. citizens, to apply pressure on our leaders to recognize that some significant harm has been done, and we have a moral and ethical responsibility to acknowledge the damage that was done to the global South. on a climate front, on a
Yeah.
colonial and neo-colonial front, and it continues to this day. Number two, after
I'm going
telling the
to,
truth, is actually offering to repair these broken structures and repair the damage. And it starts with debt cancellation. We're not talking about additional loans and grants and charities. We're talking about actual transfer of financial resources to repair the damage and actual transformation of these neo-colonial structures that continue to extract wealth and resources from the global south. So as in repairing a broken system, not just transferring cash and
But
hoping for the best.
why would the United States lead in that? The picture that's on the screen now, I mean, we have technology has taken over, which means
Mhm.
you're gonna some of the infrastructure, even that we see in the pictures on the screen, that is just putting climate change off the map. I mean, the
Right.
amount of gasoline products from nylons to the clothing people wear is enormous. What are they going to do?
Absolutely.
I'm
And
going to have to interrupt both of you. Our next guest is here. Shahan Rizvi is the chairman of the Howard County Democratic, um, if I could get that up again. Shahan, please join us. Thank you so much
Hello.
for
hi.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to turn
Welcome.
the conversation a little bit towards the American Muslim community. And if we could, let's take a look at our, how many Muslims ran this year, and how many Muslims won, especially young winners. We saw in Illinois a 23-year-old Nabila Sayed winning. So I wanted to ask all of you, what were the races you were following of Muslim candidates?
I was following Keith Ellison. Um, I forgot that acronym they had for the two Muslim women. I was following both of them. Getting used to Maryland and trying to see who was running. Really, I think that I look to see what people's platforms are, not what their religion was. I was really concerned about the health and well-being of the counties, the states, wherever it is they were running from. But I was really, I have to admit, happy that Oz did not win. I was overjoyed, to put it lightly. Um, and I think that we've got a lot of work to do, but it's good work in the 2 years to come.
So I just wanted to mention that I've been kind of following Nabila Sayed on the Illinois legislator. I believe she is soon to be elected to the Illinois legislator. I think that's a huge accomplishment for Muslim women. Her name is Nabila Sayed. She's an Indian American Muslim woman that was just recently elected in Illinois, and I've been following her journey. I thought that was very impressive. What we've seen in these election cycles and past election cycles with Muslims running, I think it is becoming more competitive. I myself am the first Muslim elected chairman to the Howard County Democratic Central Committee, and I think a part of that reason is representation. If it wasn't for organizations like the United Maryland Muslim Council, Howard County Muslim Council, and Muslim councils across our state didn't give us that platform to be able to jump in and run for office, I don't think we would have been making this kind of progress in this cycle as we did this year and previous election cycles. We still have a lot of work to do. I believe in Montgomery County, we did have some Muslim brothers and sisters that weren't successful in some of the local Central Committee races. One of them was. All that to say, though, I think we can do more work in this area, and it's something that we'll need to invest our hard-earned dollars to really support these candidates. And that's really what it takes to win in these cycles. I mean, we really need to have a concentrated effort to funnel dollars and money to Muslim candidates and really encourage them and encourage others to participate in the process. I mean, that's really the only way we're going to be able to change it for the future generations.
Very true. I wanted to refer back to the American Muslim poll for 2022 that was taken by ISPU, and some of their findings. It provided a snapshot of American Muslims and Americans of other faiths, as well as no faith, 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic. And the findings from the polls reflected a nation facing economic struggles and continued racial inequity, gun violence, and an ever-growing partisan divide. And we were seeing these trends in the Muslim community as well. We found that the poll finds that the American Muslims are younger than other faith and non-faith groups surveyed. And 1/4 of American Muslims are between the ages of 18 and 29 years old. And so this was a surprise to me. But then I saw these humongous lines of Gen Z. So what do you all think of that? The Gen Z effect and that impact on American Muslim community as well, getting them ready to run, seeing these young people running for office and winning.
I believe we did see one Gen Z person, don't recall which seat he was running. I want to say maybe even Congress that was elected. Apparently the first member of the Gen Z generation that was elected to Congress. So they're absolutely stepping into the arena, and they should be encouraged to do so. And it's through some more of our partnering organizations that we can continue to build this pipeline and have young people part of the process. You know, a lot of where I got my start early on in politics, half the time it was just showing up. I mean, that's really all it came down to. I didn't do anything special. I didn't advocate in any different way. I just simply showed up. And as I showed up to represent the Muslim community and more political engagements and events, that started to have folks in the local clubs, the political central committees to look at me and say, hey, we see you coming out for the Muslim community quite a bit. Why don't you run for office? Why don't you get involved in the process? And that encouragement is really what got me to go further into my trajectory to one day become a county party chair. And again, you know, it really just came down to having the opportunity to be encouraged to run for it and just showing up. You know, you'll be surprised how much of the younger generation, I feel sometimes, doesn't have an active role in participating in our political process or local political clubs. Maybe it's general apathy. Maybe it's because our partisan politics are so divided now that that message doesn't necessarily resonate with young people. But that age group, especially in politics, that 18 to 35 age group is something we must do a better job of attracting. And I don't know if TikTok is the answer. I don't know if Instagram marketing is the answer, but there's some disconnect that we've got to do and get around to figure out how we're going to get more Gen Z and more folks in that 18 to 35 group to participate in the political process. I mean, even now, the folks that still turn out the most tend to be in that age 50 plus, 55 age range. Senior citizens, of course, come out and vote. And that's something we really need to figure out. What are we going to do to extend and encourage more young folks to participate in the political process?
Dr. Fadl, we also...
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that really motivate the younger people to participate in the political process is economic issues. We've seen it during the 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaign, especially on the Bernie Sanders side of the political spectrum, how much young people were kind of fired up about issues related to student debt, issues related to climate change, to jobs, to inequality, all of these things that for the younger generation, when they look at their parents' generation and they see the difference between what they've experienced and what they're going through, that's where they get cynical with the political establishment that doesn't seem to offer transformative solutions, or at least solutions that are transformative enough, bold enough. That's how we engage with young people, by drawing them in with the issues and opening the doors to participants, not just as voters, not just as canvassers, but as active citizens in the political process. And that's how we get younger people to actually run and participate and represent their communities, very, very diverse communities. So the economic issues tend to be very important for the young generation.
Now, the 2020 election saw a historic turnout for the presidential election, but voter suppression remained a critical issue. And this poll finds, research finds that it persists and it reflects racial discrimination in the voting process. And among Muslims who were eligible to vote, 46% report experiencing some obstacle to casting their vote during the past 4 years. So, Dr. Amina, commentary on that?
Well, I think they will. In times past, we drove people to the polls. And there tended to be a thing of when people saw you coming in a car with lots of other folks, their intimidations and stuff dampened down. Lots of times, these are years ago, we would station people around the polls to compete with those who would intimidate. You know, it's not a matter of who you vote for, it's that you get to vote. To keep people from intimidation, because the same rules apply. You're going to arrest somebody, you got to arrest both. I think that with the Muslim communities, and back to what the gentleman said from, I forget which county it is, I'm still getting used to Maryland. I think we need to encourage that in two ways. One is that the masajid can hold political civics classes, you know, after Juma on Sunday. And young men like him can go and talk, you know, at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, you know, about civics and not only the importance of the vote, but what concerns you. And then you find out what concerns, at the same time, encourage them to help people protect the vote.
Very important. Dr. Fadl, we saw Palestinians win around the country. AIPAC poured millions into elections, but Summer Lee won the House seat in Michigan. So what does this say about the impact of AIPAC and the fact that we're seeing people like Ruqayya Roman and Abdul Nasir Rashid and Rashida Tlaib winning?
I think it has to do with the work on the ground that those candidates have done in their communities. If we truly believe in a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, then we have to put the hard work to protect those principles. And the amazing work that those candidates have done in their communities and their districts to bring people out to vote, to educate the public about the issues that they're fighting for, to give their constituents hope that they will have somebody in Congress to fight for them, to represent them, not to represent the interest of corporations or any other entities. I think ultimately, no matter how much money you pour into, negative advertising and smear campaigns, it's that face-to-face contact with the candidates, with their canvassers and with their staffers who convey the message directly face-to-face, as opposed to through mail or other resources. I think that's ultimately what got those candidates to win. And that's the lesson that everybody else has to learn, that we're going to have to fight for this democracy tooth and nail, canvassing and engaging with constituents directly, face to face, and with the issues that they actually care about, and carrying that voice in Congress.
Mr. Berry, one comment I did want to make on this very important topic, I thought it was pertinent since you asked the question of Palestinian folks being successful. One major thing that has led to that has definitely been Muslim advocacy work throughout the country. And one of the groups I really want to give a special shout out to and highlight is Engage. Mgage was very, very impactful in the 2020 elections, primarily with data-driven statistics and that kind of information to help campaigns on the ground. And if it wasn't for that advocacy work, it really would have not allowed us to change fundamental things in some of our political parties. For example, I was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, an at-large delegate for Joe Biden. And one of the duties we do as a delegate is to pass the party platform, the Democratic National Committee platform. This was the first year, 2020, that I saw when we approved that Democratic Party platform, a recognition of the conflict of what was happening in Israel-Palestine. And that recognition is embedded and written for the first time into our Democratic National Committee platform. Now, it doesn't go farther enough. It's not further enough in the sense that it's going to give any sort of relief as our political process to help the plight of our brothers and sisters in Palestine, but it was a recognition. That language would not have gotten in there to the Democratic National Party platform had it not been the work for groups like Engage. And that's something we really should celebrate, that we now have apparatuses like the Democratic National Committee that is seeing this for the first time, hearing the experiences of Palestinian communities and other Muslim communities, and that being reflected in some of our political parties and our values, which I was very proud to see.
Well, thank you for that. And that's surprising to hear because Engage has been through the controversy about Palestine, and Engage's role in advocating for Palestine has been a topic in the Muslim community. Let me turn towards local, all politics is local, as we often hear. What did you see, Shahan and Dr. Fadl and Dr. Amina, in your local districts? What issues were driving people to the polls in your local districts?
Wow. Well, I live in Baltimore County, and right where I live in a wonderful place called Nottingham, wherever that is. And a lot of the people who live there seem to be some young people with kids, but loads of older people. People are worried about Medicare, Social Security, the economic forecast, more so than they're actually worried about jobs. Not the jobs are not secondary. They're helping their kids pay off college loans. Uh, but I know that the economy, the other thing that seemed to come up in overhearing conversations, believe it or not, was that of immigration. There, and I didn't expect it in Maryland. I expected it in Illinois when I was living in Chicago, but I didn't expect it in Maryland. And when I think it was the man in Florida bust all those people up to what was it? Martha's Vineyards. It's like, is Maryland next? So you would hear little tidbits in the grocery stores, pharmacy, you know, but the things I didn't hear a lot about in the election itself. Young people like my granddaughter were very, very worried about, is Biden going to keep his promise for giving student loans or things like that. So I don't know, it was a mixture. I'll say it was a mixture, but the economy, not understanding what it meant when the feds raised the rates. What does that mean for my mortgage? Social Security is on somebody's plate today, it's not on there tomorrow. What does all that mean?
Shahan?
Yes, I think in Howard County, usually the main driver for our elections, for sure, education is primarily in focus. We have amazing schools here in Howard County. That continues to be the reason why families move here to this county, and why our population is still identified as, based on the 2020 census, like almost the second fastest growing population in the state of Maryland. So education is why voters come. People have come to expect Howard County to produce excellent schools. I think safety is something we saw a lot from voters. There has been a national uptick in crime, and safety has been on the forefront of a lot of folks and voters. Columbia, a city here in Howard County, was voted recently the safest city in America. I think that's something that one of the reasons that helped with the reelection of our county executive, who has provided an environment to create the good safety, good schools. No doubt pocketbook issues played a significant role in the elections, inflation, rampant inflation, small business opportunities, contracting opportunities. We also saw women's reproductive rights also as a major issue when you went knocking on doors, talking to voters. This was something very concerned, particularly the U.S. Supreme Court's reversal of Roe v. Wade. So that's something we saw that energized a lot of the Democratic base a little bit in this election as well. Those have been primarily the issues: education, women's reproductive rights, and safety. I would say were the top three issues for Howard County.
Dr. Fadl?
Yeah, here in Ohio, as you probably noticed, the Senate seat went to the Republican Party with J.D. Vance defeating the Democratic candidate here. The economic issues and the Trump effect are dominant in terms of what brought people to the polls. The state of Ohio has been very badly gerrymandered, and that is part of the story of why the votes went the way that they went in terms of congressional seats. But also in my particular county, Licking County here, it went completely on the red side in terms of all the votes, all the way to the governor's office, the gubernatorial elections. Unfortunately, it is the reality of the deindustrialized Midwest, and this is something that we as a country have to deal with. We've seen this from the 2016 election and 2020 election, that the campaigns that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump brought to Ohio in particular in 2016 pinched a nerve, and that nerve is still raw. And those people who are fired up about these two outsider political candidates telling them that the establishment has thrown you under the bus economically, has promised you jobs, has promised you economic opportunities, and all you've gotten was outsourced jobs to the rest of the world. And those who are leaning to a Bernie narrative and his solutions voted for the Bernie campaign, and those who listen to the Trump narrative that it's about the wall, it's about the foreigners, it's about the immigrants. That's what we ended up with, and that narrative is still alive and well here. So when J.D. Vance and the Republicans came and sort of doubled down on that narrative, they found the political map ripe for that kind of narrative, and unfortunately, that's what dominates Ohio politics right now.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to have to go for a break. Thank you, Dr. Fadl, for your time. We'll be right back.
Shahan, you're an accountant?
I am not. I am actually not.
Okay, welcome back.
Trying to find
Thank you so much, Shahan and Dr. Amina, for staying. We have with us Victor Big. Victor Baig is an Indian-born Muslim American author, philanthropist, and a community leader. Thank you so much, Victor, for being here.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Peace
And
be
we,
upon you. A good evening. You know, considering everything, we did have a good evening yesterday, and hopefully have a better day tomorrow, inshallah. Thank you for having me, and I'm really privileged to be among Dr. Amina and the brother here who chairs the local Democratic Party. That's really wonderful.
thank you. We also have with us Ihsan Laki. He's the former congressional candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts 4th District. Thank you so much, Brother Ihsan.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
So great. Let's continue our conversation about how this election will impact the Muslim community. Victor, what are you seeing? What were some of the conversations you were hearing where you are in Florida?
Well, right now we're only talking about the hurricane that's about to hit us. You know, it did stay away until the voting was over. In Florida, as you know, DeSantis has won. You know, I watched the debate between DeSantis and Chris. It happened in my town, Fort Pierce, which is stone throw, and it is the center of the eye of the hurricane this evening. I'm not there though. I'm here in Virginia with our daughter. So I think Chris did a wonderful job. He was very sophisticated, to the point. DeSantis used everything he could find for cultural. You know, I happen to clarify. I happen to be a Republican, longtime Republican. You know, I turned 75 next month, so I'm here as someone who has seen the community grow. And we were mostly Republicans at that time, and I stayed as a Republican. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not a Trumpist. There are the two different aspects of the Republican Party. So the way it turned out in Florida was expected. DeSantis was going to win with everything he had done, and this guy is pretty smart. And it's the only time I agree with Trump that he called him. What did he call him? Desanctimonious. You know, he is. Some people, you know, they were confused what that meant. And the DeSantis is gone to Harvard and Yale, the two schools that the Republicans say the only liberals go to. And you know, really, you know, my congressman, I'm good friends with him, Congressman Brian. I call him Brian. He's a young man, and that's one of the first thing he said when I said our son went to Columbia. So that's a liberal school. Well, now we have the governor who's gone to two liberal schools, and yet the Republicans voted for him. Mm-hmm. So we have a small community exactly where I live. If you ask me, you know, what you're hearing, some of the people that I hear from, they feel that it doesn't matter who you vote for. Okay, we're not going to, you know, in particularly in Florida. So that's you know, it's a small town where I live. When I come from Michigan, that was a different story. I was elected to my school board in a conservative district back in 2000, and that was a big deal. Someone got elected to the school board, and the young man I gave the high school certificate to, he ran for the governor. Let's just think about, you know, Abdul, how far we have come. When I was listening to the conversation about the Z Gen. I'm very optimistic about our community, and I also heard about, the organizations like MPAC and MGAGE. They are doing a wonderful job. I'm near Washington D.C. now, and Rashad was one of the young men in Detroit. And again, going back to what I was saying about Republicans, 85 senators voted for him. So, I'm very optimistic about everything in this country. And then people say democracy was a challenge, but if you see, the democracy succeeded. I heard Biden wasn't talk about the success of democracy. I was wondering what he was going to talk about, and I gave some thought to it. There was no violence. There was no real. I mean, some precincts might have experienced, but I know nothing in Florida that has happened. Any kind of intimidation, especially on the Treasure Coast where I live, it's a very conservative area. And I live in a Trump building. This doesn't have a Trump name on it, but I know I can keep talking about these things. So, but I think you're on mute.
Of the faith groups in this country about the future of our country. So that's really exciting to hear. I'd like to hear from Ihsan as well. And before I pull in our next guest, Professor Grossman, on, and we'll continue this conversation about bridging the divide and talking about the Republican Party with him. But Ihsan, can you tell us more about yourself, your experience running, and what you learned from that experience?
Thank you. Well, I ran for Congress for the U.S. House of Representatives in Massachusetts 4th District in 2020. So it's been a little while. In our politics, with everything that's been going on, it feels like ages ago. So for us, that was the first year of COVID, one of the first campaigns to have to run a grassroots campaign during COVID times. And that was really challenging. As a Muslim candidate, I was very proud to represent our community, to represent our values of compassion, of taking care of our neighbors, and of really looking after the most vulnerable in our communities. I drew a lot on both my personal lived experiences, being an immigrant from Morocco, North Africa, who came here at age 20 and worked the restaurant jobs and worked my way up to becoming a special examiner at the Federal Reserve, protecting the American people from big corporate greed. And I also drew from the experiences of those who I met on the campaign trail to build a very strong racial and social justice agenda that was successful in many ways. We didn't win the race. However, we made a big sound in Massachusetts. And a lot of the time, states like Massachusetts, who are called blue states, well, we're kind of purple. And Trump and his followers have had a dent on the state. But in these states, we are historically the leaders for progressive policy. And we face a lot of hurdles in making sure that we are states where everybody feels that we belong. Especially as a Muslim community, we barely scratched the surface on representation in Massachusetts. And as you saw in last night's results, Massachusetts is not listed on the list of these fabulous candidates across the United States of America who were successful. So that is something that I ask our viewers to bring attention to, that we really need to work hard also in states where we think of them as our cushion for progressive policy and for protecting the identities of all Americans, including Muslim Americans.
Well, thank you. We have to take a break at this moment. Thank you, Shahan, for being here and contributing to this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. We have with us Matt Grossman, who's the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research and the professor of political science at Michigan State University. Thank you so much, Dr. Grossman, for being here.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Well, let's get right into it. I want to talk about this red wave that we were supposed to see, the Republican wave. Did you see it?
Well, the party out of the presidency tends to lose in the midterm election, especially the first midterm of a new presidency. But we saw a very modest loss of support by the Democrats last night, and nowhere near the average midterm losses in the House, the Senate, or in state legislatures. Saw actually gains in governorships. So we really didn't see the red wave that some were expecting this year.
But in your book, Red State Blues, you talk about how there is that the Republicans have really worked hard locally at the state level, and they've gained substantial political control of state governments. So now looking at this election, do you think it's supporting your thesis? Number one, that's one question that I wanted to ask you. And how have they done this in the states that they have done the work in, getting state governments?
Well, that's right. Republicans went from controlling only 3 states in the early 1990s to controlling 27 states, more than half during the Trump administration. So that was a considerable rise, and Democrats lost as a proportion of state legislatures in both chambers throughout that period. They have seen a bit of an uptick and a return, but nothing that would sort of change the broader patterns. Now, in Michigan, where I am, there was a historic night. For the first time in 40 years, Democrats will control the governorship, the House, and the Senate in Michigan. So that was a significant shift that took place in the midterm elections. The main reason that took place, though, was actually a redistricting commission that was able to change the redistricting process this time so that the winner of the statewide vote would be much more likely to actually control the state House and the state Senate. And so Democrats won the statewide vote, and they'll be in charge in the House and the Senate, as well as the governorship, beginning next year. In the past, Democrats had been able to win the statewide vote, but it hadn't translated into actual majorities in the state legislature. And that's still the case in places like Wisconsin.
Interesting. Dr. Amina, I wanted to ask you, is there room in the Republican Party for Muslims, especially social conservatives amongst us?
Sure. But I want to, if you don't mind, Henna, I want to go back to something Professor Grossman said. What do you think caused the shift in Michigan?
Well, Gretchen Whitmer performed even better than expected, winning probably by about 10 percentage points statewide. But the big shift was that the redistricting commission was in charge of drawing the maps this time, in contrast to the Republican legislature. So Democrats went from basically with the same statewide vote that they had in 2018, they went from controlling 10 Senate seats to 20 Senate seats, just because of where those votes were concentrated in 2018. Republicans had done an efficient job of sort of packing Democratic votes into a small number of districts. They weren't able to do that after the redistricting commission. And so essentially with the same statewide vote profile, this time Democrats got a majority.
I see. Now back to your actual question, Hina. I think that diversity is good. I mean, there are some socially conservative folk among us. there used to be a lot. Victor, who I've met on the phone, in addition to these election things, is probably one of them. Many of the African American Muslims are socially conservative. Um, on one hand. On the other hand, they still think that they're being left out of many conversations, whether it's climate change or Medicare or, health inequities, prison reform, all of that long list of things that Muslim candidates have not been great at speaking out about. So those candidates on the other side who do will draw their attention. There was a campaign by Black talk radio host, which got behind Palestinians, and it revealed all of the Black folk running for offices who had been bought off by the Israeli PACs. And the word was out, do not vote for them under any circumstances, no matter what they say to you, no matter how much money. And that word went around throughout the country.
Interesting. Now, when we look at political divisions, we see that Americans are not completely locked into ideological bubbles, even though that's what we keep hearing on
Right.
TV and we hear it on media. If you watch Fox News or MSNBC, but political differences do remain a substantial barrier in relationships, and most people are reluctant to engage in these discussions because there's just this lack of respect. You see it on social media. People are, typing away and just forgetting that there's a human being behind. So, and I'd like to ask Professor Grossman, because this is some of the research that you've done. For example, with Thanksgiving coming up, where do we go from here after the elections? People will be some people will be not accepting that they lost. There will be these conversations going on. Where do Americans go from here?
Well, we do have differences, and one of the reasons that we have polarization is because in comparison to 30 or 40 years ago, people recognize clear differences between the political parties and have largely chosen a side. They've largely figured out which political partisan side they typically agree with. And that means that they don't make as many election to election decisions. But that's not everyone. And we tend to overestimate the differences between us and sort of see the most extreme member of the other party as the quintessential member of the party. So, for example, that's true in social divisions. We think of, say, that white evangelical male living in the South as the Republican, and we think of the Democratic Party as primarily composed of minority groups, of strong liberals. And the same thing is true of issue positions. We view the average Democrat or the average Republican as having the most extreme views of people in that party. And that does exacerbate our differences. There was actually an interesting study after the 2016 election, speaking of Thanksgiving, that Democrats visiting Republicans based on cell phone data left their family Thanksgiving early after 2016 in comparison to previous years, just because of the surprise after Trump's election. It was really just sort of too hard to face your Republican relatives if you were a Democrat. So there are real social consequences, but some of it comes from just sort of assuming the worst of the other side. We actually run a program in Michigan where 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans who want to run for political office actually travel the state with one another and get to know the state. We have found that as long as you introduce people to one another and they start on a perspective of friendship and getting to know the state together, that they tend to get along quite well. You can bridge some of those differences pretty fast with a social commonality.
Victor, where do you think the Republican Party is headed? Do you see, we saw a bunch of Muslims running from the Democratic platform. Do you see Muslims running from the Republican platform in the near future?
Okay. I've written 2 articles. If you Google me, you will see, and actually, I have a chapter in my book, my memoir, A Muslim Republic in the Trump Age. And then after the convention, I wrote an article about what I would like to see a Republican Party to be. We have to engage to point out. Dr. McLeod referenced to the African American community on the conservative side. 19% of the African Americans voted for DeSantis. So that should give you a thought. Family and faith, the 2 things that are very important for the Muslims. And I see we make a good connection there with the Republicans. What really it makes a difference is when the politics comes into play, and then you see the dividing lines. They just want to see a Republican in the office, a Republican Senate, a Republican in the White House. But I feel, and you have seen it in the results that have unfolded last evening, the Americans are in the middle. When I talk about I'm a Republican, people see my views and say you could be a moderate Democrat or a moderate Republican. I lived in Michigan 50 years. I built a community there. I was very close friend with Governor John Engler. He was with me the first time he won the election at the mosque. You don't see the Republicans do that anymore. So we have a long history of working with the Republicans. And then, as I said, the faith and family are the 2 things that I find I can connect with them very well. So I know we have to be in both the parties, and it seems that more of the Muslim communities is getting more involved with the Republican Party, and I really look at the scene here is we have 4 different groups. One is far left progressives that I don't identify with some of the things, and of course the Trumpists on the other side. So the country is in the middle, and that's the elections has proved that. So depends on the candidate. And I have very good relations with my Republican congressman Brian Mast, who lost both his legs in Afghanistan. Very conservative guy, and he offered to fight for Israel. He's that but I have found rapport with him on different issues, like for example, the situation in India. Then I can work very closely with him. Then the other point, the problem with the Republicans that I see, like J.D. Vance, I quoted him in my memoir. I read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, and I thought, he's going to be really great. But what he said about getting Trump support, he said you got to suck it up and just just go along. And if you saw his pictures, he has an Indian wife, Usha, and he never brought her out during the campaign. So these guys, they put, what should I say, a face. That's one of the problems that I have, the sincerity. And as far as Dr. Oz, I will just say that from what I heard, he's a Sufi. So I would have liked to see those 2 races switch. I still like Fetterman too, but if Oz has won in Pennsylvania and Vance has lost in Ohio, I would be happier.
Well, thank you. We're going to go to break right now. Thank you so much, Dr. Amina, for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us. We have two more guests that are going to be joining us in the next hour. Please invite up, have Scott Hibbard join us. He's the associate professor and chair of political science at the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy. He teaches politics of the Middle East, religion, politics. Thank you so much for being here, Scott.
Thanks. Nice to see you all.
Good. We also have with us Mitchell Brown.
Good evening.
Good evening. Professor in the Department of Political Science at Auburn University and is an associate editor of the Journal of Political Science Education, a founding editor of the Journal of Election Administration Research and Practice. Really looking forward to talking to both. Look at projection about the results. We see Republican candidates have swept elections for state Supreme Courts in North Carolina and Ohio on Tuesday, and that these victories could prove pivotal in future disputes over state legislative and congressional maps in both states. But there's been a string of state judicial contests marked by partisan attacks, and we're seeing heavy spending by outsiders. I want to discuss all of that with y'all. And we're also seeing Democratic candidates prevail in races in Illinois and winning 2 seats in Michigan. I just heard locally in Maryland, Congressperson Dutch Ruppersberger has won over the Republican nominee Nicole Lee, who actually used to be. We've worked with her a lot on Rohingya cause, so that was a race that I was following very closely as well. So all of this is going on right now. And as far as recent numbers that we can, CNN was projecting Congress at 100 Democrats and 202 for Republicans the last time I checked, and hopefully we can get updated figures as we're speaking. But yes, can you tell us what surprised you, Dr. Grossman? Let's go to Dr. Grossman, and then we'll do a roundtable round. Scott, would you like to go? What's going on? Mitchell, are you able to unmute yourself?
I am unmuted. I'm happy to jump in. Though, if you could repeat the last part of your question.
So I just wanted to see, what surprised you so far in the election results.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So what I study is election administration and not so much the horse race aspects of elections. And I spent the last several days observing elections. The results certainly weren't quite as in favor of the Republicans as a lot of people thought they would be. And I think that really speaks to division in the Republican Party that we've been seeing gaining some momentum lately. From the election administration side, I think we continue to see elections that are stories about good government and how government's supposed to work. There are hiccups in the process. Certainly, we see them in certain places. But a mark of a good election isn't that everything's perfect. It's that when something goes wrong, people immediately recognize it and work to correct it. I think the bigger issue going forward that we have to think about is with conservative judges winning in really big numbers, and a lot of the things that are happening in the election administration space really ending up in the courts and having final words in the courts, what that's really going to mean.
That's interesting. Let's talk about, before I jump to others, the election and the judges' races. What I found, as even I have a first-time voter in the family, my daughter, and talking to her, talking to other people who are going to the polls, I found that a lot of people just did not know much about the judges that they were voting for. So a lot of people research, congressmen, they might research their county executives or school board. But when it comes to judges, many times they do not know what these judges stand for, what their records have been like. And so I'd love to hear more from you on that aspect.
Sure. I'll start, but say that I'm not a court expert in any way. We elect judges because the idea is that it is a guard against corruption in the court systems, rather than having the judges appointed. And that works when people know who they're voting for and what kind of person gets on the bench from the election. Unfortunately, most people have no idea who the judges are when they vote for them. I've talked with people who told me that their strategy when voting, other than just going with party in cases where there is a clear party affiliation, is I liked their name, or I heard a neighbor say they'd met them before, or it was the first name on there. And so it's a real challenge when people don't know who it is that they're electing and just pick.
True. So Scott, let's go back to my original question. What surprised you as these results were coming in?
Okay. Sure. Thanks. Now, I think one of your other guests was about ready to leave, and she wanted to say a final word. So, Isain, tafadhal.
Isain, go ahead.
Thank you. It's on.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, I just, wanted to give a last word. Not directly with regards to your question now, but there have been talks before about what you called or has been called socially conservative Muslims in the community, and whether having socially conservative representation through the Republican Party is something that that people that should be happening or should be acceptable. I specialize in working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wholeheartedly believe that the United States of America is a country where we all belong. And belonging really means to be represented, to have freedom, to have our rights fought for in our country, and to not force other people to follow what we think is principle in our own faith. That's very important. So if we want a country where all belongs, where all is represented, then we should actually follow what I believe is our Muslim principles, the principles of unity, of freedom, and of allowing people to come to their faith however they want and whenever they're ready. And so I personally would not support somebody who's so-called socially conservative. I don't even believe in what is socially conservative. It's either we are for unity, we are for all, we are for anti-racism, we are for anti-bigotry and anti-hate, or we're not. And so I urge, the viewers, I urge people who are discussing these issues to really distinguish between what is common sense issue Republican and what is racist or hateful Republican. Those are completely different things. And I think the Republican Party over time has deviated way far from having common sense. And so thank you for hosting me. I know I've been here for a while listening, but I'm really happy I got to chime in before I take my little girl to bed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to discuss a little bit about the squad winning across the board with you, but totally understand it's a school night. So thank you so much for being here.
Okay. To the squad. Thank you.
So by the way, thank you for that statement. I'll see if I can kind of tie some of the recent comments together. I too actually grew up in Michigan, from Grand Rapids, and so you asked me what's the surprising things that unfolded in the last night. One was that Jerry Ford's old district in Grand Rapids, used to be the 5th district, now is the 3rd, was won by a Democratic woman. First time that seat's gone Democrat in decades, aside from a brief period in the 1970s. But to me, that kind of highlights a larger issue that the Republican Party is fractured, and the places where the Republican Party did well, there were establishment candidates running. Where they did poorly, you had MAGA, Trump supporter, exclusive nationalists running, and you saw this play out in Illinois as well. We had a gubernatorial race that was really not even close, in part because in the primary, the Republican Party elected the more extreme candidate, and he could win the primary and he could win downstate, but he couldn't win statewide. And again, it gets back to this notion of inclusiveness versus exclusiveness. Similarly, in Michigan, you had a gubernatorial candidate who won the primary. He was backed by the DeVos family, and base mobilized, and they put forward something that was very, very, very conservative. But that person was very out of step with kind of where the mainstream voters were. And I think this is where I've always said elections are won or lost in the middle, and there's the moment where the Republican Party, because it was catering to that Trump base and that very exclusive vision of American national identity, they overplayed their hands. And so they've, and in areas like, Michigan and Illinois and elsewhere, they did not do well. Now, we live in a fragmented society. And so other areas, those themes did play well. But the last comment I'll just make about this is, there is this, an issue of gerrymandering, which the previous guest, Professor Grossman, I believe, was talking about in the last half hour. And, that, is, shaping, is going to shape the outcome of the House of Representatives. I haven't seen the numbers yet, but I would venture to guess, or I would actually bet that the Democrats won a majority of the popular vote, but that will not translate into a majority of the House votes because of the way in which the Houses are apportioned through state legislatures. And so, so you will have a minority party, if you will, running the House of Representatives, and so that kind of remains to be. We'll see how that plays out. I have more thoughts on all this stuff, but I'll let other people chime in.
Thank you so much. We are also, I just wanted to introduce our guest, Sam Workman, who's a professor of political science and director of the Institution of Policy Research and Public Affairs at the John D. J. Rockefeller School of Policy and Politics at West Virginia University. Thank you so much. We have all these amazing minds in political science with us today, and I'd love to have play you guys against each other and get some conversations going. I am looking at these results, and I'm thinking, what does this mean for 2024? So, Sam, if you'd like to take that.
Well, that's a big question, right? So, first of all, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on. I do think that lost in all this discussion of tidbits about gerrymandering and all this, I mean, the boilerplate for this entire election has to be the fact that the president faced rampant inflation, people very unsatisfied with him, very poor messaging about anything he did in the past 2 years, and Republicans still couldn't get the job done. So there's something to be said for that. And how much of that is sort of, citizen disaffection or candidate effects, who knows? As for what this means for 2024, I'll point you towards one thing, and sort of really the bright spot and kind of like, the sort of lodestar for the Republicans last night, which is the results in Florida in two respects: their performance in Miami and particularly their performance with Hispanics. And if that keeps up, Trump showed us in 2016, Republicans only need about a third of the Hispanic vote, assuming all the other hatches are battened down, to really make hay in the election. And so if anything matters for 2024, I would look to those results in Florida, because I mean you're verging on a case where Florida is no longer purple; it's actually just red, right? And so if that's true, then it's a harder road to hoe for the Democrats moving forward, just in general.
Dr. Grossman, your thoughts?
Well, historically, there's no relationship between performance in the midterm and performance in the subsequent presidential election. So we don't know yet what will happen in 2024. We don't even know yet what happened fully last night. But I did want to chime in on a couple things. First, we actually don't know yet if the Democrats will win the popular vote for the House. They're behind by about 4 points right now. But there's lots more vote coming in. And it does appear that there was just very different outcomes due to redistricting in different places. In places like Michigan, where we had an independent redistricting commission, the statewide votes were much more reflected in the balance of seats. In places like Florida and New York, where there was an aggressive gerrymander, the most aggressive nationally, Republicans will be gaining seats. In New York, where there was an attempted aggressive Democratic gerrymander that was overturned by the courts, Democrats will not have that advantage and are losing some seats. So it's sort of a state by state election with some real differences this year based on what was on the ballot and how the districts were drawn. In Michigan, we were the center of abortion, the discussion of the Roe v. Wade race, the Roe v. Wade being overturned, and voters having a chance to directly enshrine reproductive rights in the state constitution really seems to have driven Democratic turnout in a way that it wasn't necessarily driven in places like New York and Florida, and might have been the key to this election not following the traditional pattern of midterm elections.
Scott, I'd like to ask you, as we're looking at wanted to talk about this yesterday, and we got into it a little bit, um, but there wasn't enough. Like, I felt like we need to really look at this closer too. So one of the conspiracy theories, like conspiracy theories have had an effect on this election in the past 2 years, just politics in the United States. But one of the conspiracy theories is obviously about foreign interference in US elections. But as we look at data, it's not just a conspiracy theory. We do see China interfering in US elections at a much more candidate to candidate basis versus Russia's interference, where we're seeing more of manipulation through media or other means like that. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, on foreign manipulation, or foreign impact of.
So before we get there, one comment on the previous comment. One of the things that we have to also keep in mind is it's not being altogether even clear how these races are going to come out. I mean, the Senate could go Republican, it could go Democrat. I mean, it's still very much up in the air. And the House, while there is a path for the Dems to actually win, and I don't think they will, and I don't think they'll hold it. I think it will not be the massive gain of seats, but this gets your question. Like, when you're thinking about 2024, I'm just wondering what 2023 is going to look like, and it could be really ugly. And if both chambers are in the Republicans' hands, it's going to be just nonstop investigation and obstruction, and it's going to be a really, really difficult time, for the next 2 years until 2024. And we'll see how that plays out. So as far as election interference, I mean, Russia is really the big player here. I mean, they were heavily involved in 2016. They've been heavily involved in other, campaigns around the world. Their target is to divide the West, and because they are, relatively, they are a nuclear power, but they have oil, but that's really about it. Their economy is about the size of Italy's, but they have enormous, but they've have military capability and what have you. So as long as the West is united, they're always going to be contained. So, but if the West is divided, they're going to have greater room for operation and latitude. And so this is one of the reasons why they went all in on Donald Trump. I mean, read the Mueller report. It's not conspiracy. It's they were whether or not the Trump campaign was working with them, that's a separate matter, but it was clear that they were, very much involved in kind of fomenting division within the U.S., fomenting a lot of fake news, trying to foment, these kinds of culture wars as a way of kind of pulling the conservative right into their orbit and having more influence in American politics. And because Facebook and social media kind of cleaned up their act between 2016 and today, you didn't see that same kind of interference. There was some concern that once Elon Musk bought Twitter, you were going to see kind of resurgence of this. But at the end of the day, I don't think that. I think as a country, we've gotten better at responding to this. And my hope is that going forward, outside interference will be minimized. And just so we're clear, there's always been external interference in elections. And the U.S. during the Cold War did a lot of it. So this is just part of the game. But I think that, and maybe our first guest can elaborate on this. But our election security is actually quite good, and much better than what people tout it to be.
Yeah. Mitchell, I'd like to ask you if you could also, from an administrative point of view, especially looking at Arizona, if you could talk about that, what we saw in the election, how that would impact 2024 administratively, and two, if you could also speak a little bit about foreign interference and the security of our election system.
Sure. I'll be happy to address both of those. I think one of the big fears going into this election was that there were a lot of election denier candidates on the ticket. And offices where there would be direct influence over the electoral process. We haven't seen a whole the number of those people get elected as was feared at first. And so some of the questions then that people have is what happens if these people get into office? What happens when they get into office because they're so concerned that there has been something nefarious? There's this giant plot, conspiracy across the country. And the answer is no way. One of the things that makes US elections so unique in the world, but also particularly secure, is that we have this really diffused system where we've got 50 states with different rules and processes within those states. At the local level, you have a lot of local control in most of the states. Some of the states use all the same equipment. Some of the states don't use all the same equipment. But what we also have in all of the offices is levels and levels of redundancies and security and chain of custody, both for physical election equipment and for the electronic election equipment. What we've seen in Arizona is not surprising at all. There were always going to be challenges there. Any of the states where there's a real question about the results and whether the state might flip, particularly in the Senate, we're going to see lots of court challenges. What we saw was poll watchers in all of those states that have important Senate seats. And they were there because we should expect these challenges. I feel like I need to let Matt Grossman jump in.
Nat or Sam?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I would say that in terms of election administration, so we here in West Virginia, we just went around the state doing an election integrity project. I think, the data for fraud, and especially fraud on a sort of calculated scale such that it would change election, it's nil, right? And certainly not enough that any court has taken it up. But that doesn't mean that. I think the important thing for these sorts of discussions is that doesn't mean that perceptions of election fraud can't destabilize democracies, right? And so the real threat from concerns about election security stem from these perceptions that possibly there was fraud, right? And so what happens then is those perceptions, if that's sort of the perspective you're in, those perceptions legitimate alternative forms of civic engagement, and those alternative forms may not be sort of the sort of things that are healthy for democracies and an engaged public and rule of law and all these sorts of things. So those perceptions, even in the absence of data, can destabilize democracies. My colleague Eric Heron, who has been sent to observe elections all over the world, tells me a bunch of times that this is one of the central drivers of sort of destabilizing democracies, right? So even in the absence of actual fraud, right, and sort of thought out fraud, these things can be very harmful in terms of perceptions.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on this, and this ties in a larger issue of misinformation and disinformation. One of the interesting things about Chicago politics is there was a right-wing billionaire who was funneling money into a newspaper that was being sent all around Chicago, and it was portrayed as a local newspaper, but it was full of a lot of innuendo and misinformation, coupled with local sports news of local high schools. And it was a very surreal thing, but it was it was all kind of targeted at undermining on the one hand confidence in elected officials, but also confidence in the system writ large. And going back to the previous speaker's point, I mean it's really pernicious, and I think that will continue even if this election it didn't have a significant impact, at least in our area.
And definitely this point about billionaires investing money into elections, this is something that is very, very concerning. It was like 16 billionaires have invested billions of dollars, and what that means for democracy. And I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about campaign financing next. But one more question that I had for Mitchell, which I know my kids might want to know this. So we see, and we were discussing this earlier, that how do we get young people to vote? Like, how do we get them involved and civically engaged and involved in wanting to run for office, or just even getting out and vote? And one of the things that often comes up is that, oh, why do they make it so hard? Like, why isn't the day a federal holiday? Why can't we just go online and click a button like we do for everything else? Like, it would make it so much easier. So Mitchell, what would you say to our young listeners who might be listening to this?
I think the easiest point of entry for young people about getting involved and really engaged is actually to volunteer to be a poll worker. It's exciting. I've spent years in the polls and looking at the voting process, and then behind the scenes, looking at a tabulation and ballot adjudication. And being a poll worker is a wonderful experience, a way to get younger people to really understand the process better, because we do a terrible job in this country of explaining to the general public how our election systems work and what we're doing. And I think, frankly, better civics education would go a long way to solving some of the problems we have around mis and disinformation too. Certainly misinformation. Disinformation is a different kind of nut to crack, but getting people involved that way through really low level points of entry like election day work, I think is a great way to start.
I think, and to dovetail with Mitchell as well, so when we were doing our projects here in the state, you can pose to people the sort of conundrum between election security and access to the ballot. And what emerged from all of our discussions, no matter where we went, is the thing people cared most about was actually the nuts and bolts, the bureaucratic elements. How efficient are our elections? How soon will votes be counted and we'll get results and all that. So the concerns were actually all feasibility and logistical, and these broader debates that elites take up really aren't what animate discussions in the general public. So.
Any more thoughts from?
I'll just add that we grossly underfund elections in this country. It's hard to know how much money actually is given to support an election office, because we've got so many different rules and arrangements and fiscal years even. It's a really tough thing to study. We've done one study where we looked at a simple ratio of the ratio between the election office budget and the county budget, and huge variance, of course, but on average, we're spending 0.5% of a county's budget on the thing that is most central to undergirding American democracy. And we underfund it. And so it's no wonder that all these billionaires have seen funding election administration itself as a way to get in. And of course, this causes concern from people wondering about integrity issues. And so the simple solution to all of this is we don't need private money in elections. We need more public money in elections.
Let's talk about that more. 20 donors alone, $881 million in this midterm election. What can we do to stop this?
Very little. Since Citizens United was passed in the Supreme Court, it's counted as free speech. So, it's kind of it's the Wild West for campaign finance. And I remember when I worked on Capitol Hill back in the day, and I remember my one of the House members I worked for at the time spent $1 million in campaign cycle, and we just thought it was just an obscene amount of money. And because back then the average election was like $2,500 or $250,000. Now that's just nothing. And even in our gubernatorial race, we had 3 different billionaires, kind of vying for or backing different candidates. I mean, J.B. Pritzker, our governor, is actually a millionaire. He spent $150 million out of his own pocket. But you had Ken Griffin, who cut a check for $50 million for a Republican primary candidate, and then individual in Uline cut another $10 million for this, for Darren Bailey. So it's just, I mean, I hate to say this, but this is the game that we're working in. This is the environment we're operating in, and there's a pernicious element to it. No two ways about it.
Matt, do you think there's anything else that we could do? I mean, I understand. So I just refuse to accept that we can't do anything
accept
about it.
defeat, right? No, sanity should prevail. Yeah, of course. Anyway, I'm sorry, Matt. I know you need to go, but. Fine.
Well, we did pass some new financial disclosure laws in Michigan this election, so we had a little bit, at least on the disclosure side, but there is a lot of money in elections, and I don't see any attempt to really prevent that in the future. I actually spent yesterday trying to help students vote at Michigan State, so experiencing some of that election administration firsthand. And we're in the most expensive US House race in the country in terms of television ads. But there were a lot of students who still didn't know who the House of Representatives candidates were in their district. There were many students who believed that they could show up at any polling place, and as long as they were registered in the state, that they'd be able to vote there. And there's a lot of reforms that we've done to make it easier to vote. You can vote in advance now. You can register on the same day that you vote. But that also, creates long lines and what looks like election procedures not working, but is in fact a way to sort of make it easier for people who aren't registered in advance to still carry out their civic duty on election day. So sometimes what can look like a mess, it might actually be a sign of helping people to carry out their vote in as best way as they can. But it was a lesson to me just in basic civic literacy that people don't necessarily even understand if they're a first-time voter, that you have a polling place that is attached to your address, and you would have to change it if you move.
Yes, definitely. These getting out the vote exercises need to really, I feel like this should be a class offered aren't we teaching this in American Gov in high school? How to vote, especially seniors should be taught this.
Yeah, there was a recent review of the evidence on civic education that was pretty negative overall, and started concluding that a lot of civic education does not work. But what they recommended was focus on just the logistics of things like voting, registering. That's actually what people need to know, not sort of broad allegiance to kind of democratic ideals or whatever we are trying to teach them now in high school civics, but that just sort of the basics of the voting process and the logistics is currently missing.
Mitchell, before we move on to the next question, to answer that question, why can't we vote online?
Oh, sure. The answer to why can't we vote online is super complicated. We could vote online, but there are real questions about security. There are ways to do it. There are other countries that do it. What makes America different is a scale problem and the way the Constitution's written, and 50 states plus territories that end up getting to write their own rules and make decisions about it. One of the biggest problems with why we don't vote online right now, but we can bank online, we can have credit cards that can see us travel with ease almost anywhere in the world, is that the way the credit card companies and the banks work, there's not the immediacy issue when there's fraud. They have time to investigate fraud. They have time to get back money that's been lost. They have time to prosecute. And in an election scenario, we have limited time, and votes need to count when they're cast because of the way we set up our elections. And so it makes it a much more challenging job to figure out how to guard against and protect against integrity issues like we have in the banking industry and in the credit card industry. I think if you had, well, I did ask. Years ago, we started doing visioning exercises with election officials all over the country. We did them every year. And we asked election officials to think far in the future to the 2032 election. At the time, that seemed like a million years away. Now it seems like next week. And what they said prior to the 2016 election was, by 2032, we're going to be voting online. We're going to be voting at home. There will be kiosks in your community, at the mall, at the library, at the grocery store where you can vote. Biometrics will be everywhere. 2016 happened, and all we get now is we're going to be voting on paper in 2032. We're going to be voting on paper in 2032, and that's it. And we're not there. We're going to be there. There are certainly companies, vendors who are trying to figure out how to do this and do it well, but we're just not there yet.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to thank Dr. Grossman. He had to leave. Thank you for his time. Now, one question that I wanted to ask, this is something that has come up in our community, and this is a question that often folks that feel like they have to then compromise their values and vote for the lesser evil. And there's been lots of questions about ranked choice voting elections. Can you all explain that to us and how that works? And is that a possibility for that to be implemented in different states?
I'll let one of the others handle that. I'm actually a comparativist and IR person, but
I could jump in quickly and then feel free to follow me up and correct me. So the idea behind ranked choice voting is that when people go into the polls to vote, what they're given is the list of all the candidates, and they put those candidates in the order that they want them. And when you go to the counting process, then in the first round of counting, everybody's first preferred candidate gets counted. And there's a threshold that's set, you need 15% of the vote. Usually what they do is if there's a threshold for winning, like a simple majority, 50% plus one, if no candidate gets that, then the candidate that had the lowest number of votes or percentage of votes cast in their favor, that all of the people that voted for that candidate with the lowest, their vote then goes to their number 2 spot, and there's a recounting after that. And so you continue to have recounting until one of the candidates meets the threshold for winning. The reasons to do ranked choice voting, the idea behind it is that there's upfront cost in moving to a ranked choice voting system, but once it's in place, it's supposed to be significantly less expensive. It's also supposed to be less expensive because it gets rid of runoffs, right? Like we're going to see in Georgia. And so there are people who are like, this is actually a great reform. On the other hand, there are people that really worry that it's much too complicated, that we already don't know who we're voting for. And so the idea that we're going to rank people and the results are going to make sense. People are very worried about that. There's also concerns about how long it takes. We see Alaska having moved to ranked choice voting, and the expectation is it's going to take 2 weeks to figure out who the winner is. And so this has fomented a lot of conspiracy thinking that there's something wrong going on. And there's real concern, particularly on the right now, about ranked choice voting as a way to move forward and to reform elections. And I'll stop there if somebody else.
That's actually a great summation. I didn't realize that Alaska had ranked choice voting, which is kind of interesting. In part because there are 3 candidates running. There are 2 Republicans, Lisa Murkowski, and I can't remember the other one. And there's a Republican running. But part of the point of ranked choice voting is it's also meant to be more accurate in terms of capturing, voter will. So the Democrat polled, I don't know, like 10% of the popular vote, not nearly enough to be in the running. That person will be dropped off, and then those votes will be then either given to Lisa sitting Senator Murkowski or the other candidate. And the thing is, if you didn't have that, then the person who was at the top would win, even though it wasn't, even though they didn't have the majority, even if that wasn't the popular preference, but there's just the way the votes panned out. And I'm kind of interested to think about how this will play out if they do this in Alaska, which I assume they will. And I'm kind of wondering how it would have played out in Virginia, or so not Virginia, but in Georgia, because there was one candidate that was siphoning some votes off, and I think it was a Libertarian candidate. I'm not sure if they would have voted for Herschel Walker or for, Raphael Warnock. So.
Yeah, it gives and it helps us break through this left-right dynamics that we have, and gives us a better chance for real representation. I feel, and it also gives communities like the American Muslim community, which is a very small minority, better candidates that makes them want to go out and vote. So I think, so that's why this discussion has started.
If I can throw one last comment. I know we're going to have to end this here, but one of my pet peeves really is gerrymandering for a variety of reasons. In part because I've really watched the polarization of American society, and I continually have my continuing refrain is that the society is less polarized than our politics. I think part of the polarization is is structural, and as long as you have these gerrymandered districts where everyone's running in a safe seat or majority, then you're just playing to your base. But if you have a very, 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 or if you have like 40%, and 20% independent in a district, you've got to be able to reach out to the other side. You've got to speak to the center. And until we really have that, the incentive structure is just pernicious. And that's why one of the reasons why we have the kind of the politics that we have.
Sam, I'd like to hear from you as we wrap up. We have about 8 minutes to end this broadcast. What are you? What will? I'm looking at the Senate race. What will happen if the Republicans take the Senate? How hard will it be for President Biden to keep governing?
Well, so you're going to see a couple things, right? So with this slim House majority, Kevin McCarthy may be looking at a House of Representatives very much like John Boehner faced. I think what you're going to see out of Congress is an inability to control a lot of from the leadership to control a lot of the investigations that folks will want to do, because the sort of fringes of the party are harder to ignore when you have slim majorities. That would be my prediction. In the Senate, though, I think if Republicans, we're going to see this right away, because we're about to have a debt ceiling fight between now and the end of the year. I think if Republicans take control of the Senate, President Biden's already signaled that, the pathway through working through Congress is going to flow through McConnell, really. And so how much McConnell is going to want to do that, I know they both have a very long relationship with one another, going back decades, really, in the Senate. So if anything can be done, you'll look for those sort of negotiations directly between the president and McConnell. If the Democrats manage to hold on and you still have a tie-breaking vote, then expect more of the same. This sort of grand thinking, slimmed down by the natural process that is bargaining with sort of the range of your coalition across things. And certainly our senator here in West Virginia, Manchin, will continue to have a lot of say over what comes out of Congress, if that's the case. I don't look for the House to be very cooperative, though. I look for a lot of investigations, and the real tell, we'll know this very soon, because the real tell will be these debt ceiling negotiations over the next month and a half after the election.
Yeah, I think that is the future, unfortunately.
So as we wrap up, why did one of the questions that often comes to mind that I hear is during the last administration made very, very, pointed, like whatever their agenda was, they played out their agenda. But the past 2 years, we haven't really seen the White House, and there seems to be a lot of frustration too at the Democratic side on that the Democratic agenda hasn't been like they're not taking as advanced steps or just getting the job done.
Well,
why has that been so, and is it going to get harder now?
Sorry, I don't want to butt in here, but so first thing, I would argue that the Trump administration got very little done. It made a big show of things, but and the one thing it really did get done was tax cuts for the rich, which they had a Republican Congress that was happy to go along with, Republican House, Republican Senate. What was interesting is they couldn't get one of their signature pieces, which was repeal of Obamacare. They couldn't get that through for any number, for a variety of reasons. One of which was a really bad idea. You're going to throw 45 million people off the off the Medicare or out of healthcare. So they didn't do a lot, and their foreign policy was kind of disastrous on a number of levels. And this administration actually did get quite a bit done, given the very, 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 very narrow margins it had. I mean, it passed a major infrastructure bill. It did pass the Anti-Inflation Act. It did get many things done. I think the real problem is they just never got their messaging together. And I don't know why they weren't more forefront about what they were doing for working Americans on the campaign trail. And I think this is where there was a breakdown between the policy and the messaging.
I would agree that the messaging's been poor, but I would also say two things. The first is that bargaining for one, we lull ourselves to sort of sleep, thinking that, because a president is in power, then his or her party will get to do whatever they want in Congress. That's never the case, right? So bargaining occurs on two levels. One is sort of between the parties, but the other is within the party. And so I would say that a lot of this sort of consternation about sort of what Biden proposed versus what he got is just part of the natural process of bargaining. You wouldn't walk onto, people criticize the senator from my state, West Virginia, for not taking Biden's first offers on a lot of things, but no one walks on a car lot and gives their best offer as the opening bid for something, right? This was all naturally going to come to some sort of more center party position for the Democrats. The other thing I would say is that the majorities were bare in Congress. It's not like there were overwhelming supermajorities that Biden could just ignore the center, and Pelosi couldn't ignore the center either. And this is the same problem where McCarthy is about to face in the House, right? So for many things, more action could have been taken if not for sort of the fringes weighing in and sort of demanding things that they were unwilling to back off of. And that's just the price you pay whenever you have very slim majorities in the House and Senate. So, I'll leave it at that. That's the way. I mean, it's all bargain.
It's democracy.
That's democracy.
I'll add quickly and just say, I think the next 2 years are really the 2024 election, and that's what we're going to be doing.
Yes, that's going to be, and those people who say they're not political and they don't understand and they don't want to get involved. That's something that I would like to say, just sitting, looking at these results, looking at how close everything is. Every vote counts. And it's your responsibility, it's the community's responsibility, it's our audience, everyone watching, to get out there and go put your vote in and really use that right that has been earned, that has been fought for years, and don't take it for granted. But thank you so much for all of you for being here and for being a part of this discussion. I learned a lot from all of you. Thank you so much. And we're praying for it to be, peaceful, and that the violence that we've been thinking and hearing experts say that there will be violence, for it to continue to be peaceful as the days goes along and the rest of the results come in.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's all from the Washington, D.C. studios. This is Hena Zuberi. Assalamu alaikum.